My words of wisdom are always the same, right? People were making bread over 6,000 years ago. So if they could do it 6,000 years ago, you can do it today. No electricity, no plumbing, no refrigeration, and they were still making loaves. They might not have been as pretty, and some of yours might not be as pretty, but I promise you they're always going to taste good, okay? So just remember that when you feel like you're failing or you're not, it's not looking or feeling the way that you want it to look, just keep going. Everyone is already learning so much from last week in terms of their starter that you're just going to keep learning over and over again, okay? I still do. Here's our tools, okay? They're very similar to the starter tools, except we use a lot more when it comes to bread baking. We already talked about how important a kitchen scale is. This is really important for your bread making process. We also really want to get a dough scraper. You don't have to have any of these things, but they're really helpful. This is going to help in terms of scraping the dough out of the bowl. It's going to help with cutting your dough into two so you can make 2 loaves. It's also, once you have a floured surface, it's also going to help scrape that flour so you can toss that remainder away. So this is a really good tool. A stand mixer. So I have my KitchenAid here. This is my stand mixer with a dough hook. You definitely could just have a mixing bowl with either your hands or a whisk. That will work as well. My method is using the stand mixer, and it works really well for me, okay? The proofing containers, we went over this in last class, but we have our standard proofing basket with the cloth inside, and then once we have put our shaped loaf in there, we have a cover for that. And then we have my dollar store version where we put a tea towel and lay that out, put the dough in, cover it up, and then put a nice little shower cap on it before we put it in the fridge, okay? So that's necessary. Parchment paper, we're going to use that this time because parchment paper is what we use to put our dough on before we put it into our Dutch oven for baking. A spray water bottle, so mine is like a little misty guy like that. This is going to be necessary when it comes to the baking. We also have rice flour. Oh, that's cute. Not really like a smell good flour. That's supposed to say Flour, but whatever. So I keep my rice flour in this little guy. I think I'd originally bought this thinking like, oh, I'm going to keep my dough in this, but that didn't work out. So this is the rice flour. And I showed you guys last week the duster that I use. It's just like a tea diffuser kind of deal. You're also going to want a lame or a lamb. I don't know how they really say it. I just go with lame. But this is mine. I use the little guy, the UFO version with a little razor blade in it. Many of you who are going online and buying kits, this is usually the one that shows up with it. It'll usually have a couple extra razors. You can just go ahead and use just a razor. And I have had people who say they've used a very sharp knife to make their score in their dough. Obviously, we need flour. We use our regular white unbleached flour. We use our wheat flour. And then I already talked about rice flour. And then our Dutch oven. And thank you so much to Tish, who told us all last week that Aldi had these, because I think many of us went out and grabbed them, which is so perfect. I picked up 2, and I'm like, I'm not even going to use this one yet because it's going to stay so pretty for a while. So this is an oval one, which is perfect. A round one is fine, but these are what we use to bake our bread in the oven. My lifting apparatus, that's my thing that I made up. But this we use to halfway through the bake, pull the bread up off of the bottom of the Dutch oven so that we don't get a super burnt or over crisp bottom. A bread knife, that would be obviously for cutting our bread. And then a digital thermometer so we know if our bread is done in the oven so we can get to the internal temperature that we need. And then these are my bad boys in terms of my oven mitts. These are welding gloves. And the reason I use welding gloves is because if you can see here, I have many, many burns on my hands. I've even burned my neck before because the necklace I was wearing got too hot. And often if I'm wearing mascara when I'm baking, it is melting on my face. So just information for you because we are all going to be working with hot ovens. The reason I do welding gloves is because I am baking 4 of these at a time. As I pull them out, it tends to get very hot, and a regular oven mitt usually lets that heat through. So you guys will probably be fine with regular oven mitts, but if you are getting to a point where you're burning yourself or you are cooking more, grab those off of Amazon. I think they were like 16 bucks, okay? I think I covered all the tools for the most part. You'll probably see me use a few things here and there that I didn't mention, but not a big deal. First thing I really want to get into right now is the mixing and the measuring. And the reason I'm going to do that right away is because after the dough is done, we have to move into a stretch and fold phase. And I really want to be able to show you guys how that's done throughout the class. So we're going to go straight into mixing and measuring. And what I do is I have my bowl and it's empty, okay? I usually do measure everything out in a separate container and then pour it into here. Today, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to make sure that my scale is set to grams, okay? And then I will put this on my scale, and now I'm going to make sure it says 0 again, okay? And it does right now. So here's my starter. I fed it yesterday. Everyone can see that it got this high. You can see the line. As of this morning, it has deflated some, but still smells perfect, still very active in the bubbles there. And there's been many, many times where this is the case with my starter, and I go ahead and use it, and my bread turns out great. So I'm going to make the recipe that we have here, which I've given all of you. This is going to give us 2 loaves. If you want 1 loaf, like she had suggested for her family, go ahead and cut that in half. If you're going to go to a party and bring gifts, double that so you can get 4, okay? But we're going to start with 150 grams. So I'm at 94, 120. We're going to go kind of slow just to make sure that we don't get too much in there. Perfect. We're at 150. So I have definitely been over on my starter by 1 or 2 grams, and it's never been a problem, okay? Feel free to go ahead and just keep it that way, or if you really want, make sure it's accurate. But when it comes to the starter, which is actually, this is now being called leaven because it's our starter that's we're ready to use, just feel free to go ahead and make sure that if you're over a little bit, that's okay, because in my opinion, we're feeding it flour and water again. The same thing we do with starter. So it's going to work. It's still going to do what it's supposed to do. I'm going to cover this back up. I had 2 covers today because the fruit flies are just very interested in my starter. So I'm trying to trick them and not let them in. Okay, so now I'm going to 0 my scale. And if you want, you can add your items here. The only reason I suggest not doing that at this time is because it's very easy to go over on your items. So what I will do now is I will use this, 0 it out, and I'm going to add water to this. So water is super interesting, and it's something that I had to experiment with for a while because I was noticing I was getting very wet dough that it was so hard to work with, and it was just all over my hands. I do not like sticky hands. I don't like things sticking to my hands. And B, I would just be spending all this time, and you want to form this solid mass, but when it's sticky, you're pulling it apart all the time. So the original recipe called for 650 grams, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to try less water. So I have found that going to the 600 is the perfect amount. You really don't want a super wet dough. And I do talk about that in point number 4. It really becomes hard to work with, okay? So 600 is where you want to start. If you're finding your dough is very, very dry, go ahead and add a little bit more water. But I mean, I'm talking like a splash at a time when it's mixing is what I'll do. I did notice that with the, when I did the apple one that everyone tried last week, the apple cider one, I had to put more cider in. So even though I did replace the water with cider, it was 600. I ended up having to add more cider. I think just obviously the consistency was a little bit different. Okay, so I'm at 606. I am going to return a little bit just so I can be a little bit more accurate. We'll just give her a splash. Perfect. We're at 600. So now I'm going to add this to the starter. And I always go starter, water, flour. I don't think it really matters in terms of which way you go, but this is just what I do. Oop, I guess there was a little something in there. This is actually going to be the container that I use for our dough for the stretching, folding, and the proofing. Okay, so I'm just going to put this aside. So right now I don't know how much I can get it over there. It just kind of looks like a blob down there. There's many people who say stir your water and starter together. I do not, and my bread always turns out fine, okay? If you want to do it, go ahead. If you don't, not a big deal. Now I am going to use this to measure out my flour and salt. Okay, so I've zeroed this out. I always start with my white because that's what we use the most of, and this is 850 grams. And I'll measure 850. I'm at 5, 6. Come on, 846. All right, so we're at 853. So I always have like a little spoon and I just kind of scoop out. Perfect. Okay, so that is our white flour. Now I keep this on here. I zero this back to 0. I'll take my wheat flour, which I keep in this container. Because I don't go through the wheat flour as much as I go through the white flour, I just keep it in a container. But we're only going to do, what, 60 grams? So I have noticed that like a big heaping spoonful like that is about 30, 34. So I just kind of do, 52, 54. Okay. 59. 60. All right, got her. She's at 60. This is just the recipe that has always worked for me, and it called for wheat flour in this recipe, and so that is why I do it. You'll see when you get the sample of bread, if you look in it, you can see little specks of the wheat, but it really is more of a white bread. So it's just, the wheat flour does kind of help, and we don't use enough to really help, but there's more protein in wheat flour, so it does kind of make your bread a little bit more active, rise maybe a little faster. And I was talking with Tish earlier who said she's been using wheat flour in her starter. So wheat flour does tend to make your starter more active, but it also makes it a little thicker and a little grainier. So you can use wheat flour, and you can even look for a recipe that is a wheat sourdough where you're mainly using wheat flour or all.
I was adding more water than was called for because it was just looking like a really dry peanut butter. Like natural peanut butter when you put off some of the oil and it just has that grainy kind of look. And I was like, this doesn't look right. And I added more water and it's like, well,
yeah.
It worked out a little better, but then I had to consult with Lindsay.
That was really good troubleshooting and she wasn't nervous. I mean, she was nervous, but she wasn't afraid to be like, okay, I'm going to go for it. Yeah, but you went for it. I know. I was like, that wasn't right. She was nervous to add more water because that's not what the directions said, right? But she knew by looking at the starter that it didn't look the way that we had talked about it looking, right? So she really did add more water to make it consistent, and I think it's really going to work out for you. So I'm excited. Please send me pictures, okay? Okay, and then the last thing we add is salt. So obviously I'm going to zero out my scale again, and we're at 18 grams. So I'll go kind of slow, only because usually I'm putting in a whole bunch more, so I get a little happy on the pouring, but to be careful right now. 16, 18, perfect. Okay, so you'll also read a lot of recipes that say, put in your starter, water, and flour, mix the dough, cover it, and set it aside for 30 minutes. Then come back and add the salt. I do feel like the reasoning behind that is some people feel like the salt doesn't allow the natural yeast to start forming in there. Again, I add it right away at the beginning. I do not wait. Every loaf is turning out great for me. Okay, so if you are okay with it, just go ahead and put everything in there together at the same time. Yeah.
If you wanted to make a smaller loaf or less, can you cut it in half, the recipe in half?
Yeah, you would then be getting one loaf out of it, which is good. Like if there's not a lot of people that are going to be eating your loaf, just do one. But like I was saying to her, you know, it's not a bad idea, especially early on while you're practicing, to make the 2 loaves so that you have more to practice with, right? You can always cook both of them and freeze one, or I mean, even toss it. Really, the more you're doing it and the more you're getting the shaping and you're getting to do the stretches and folds, the better your practice is going to get when it comes to sourdough. But yes, cut it in half, double it, whatever you want works. And I'm just going to move these so you guys can all see a little bit better.
And this makes how many?
This is yielding 2 loaves for you. Yeah. I do have this recipe coming again later in the slide so that you can see a timeline of how to go from feeding the starter to when you're actually going to bake it. Okay. All right. So now we put this on. I add my dough hook. And now one thing I do like to say when we're mixing with this, with the dough or with the mixer, I start at 1. Okay. Now usually this is, oh, you know what I did? I was like, why is it not touching it? You got to lift that up. I know a lot of people have the one that goes back and forth, but I always start at 1 because if you go straight into it going fast, A, your flour is going to start like puffing out, and B, you can over mix the dough, which is like over kneading it, and you're getting rid of all of the air that you actually want to be trapped in your dough. So don't over mix it. I'll just stop it so you guys can kind of see where it's at right now. So it's real shaggy and real floury right now still, okay? Once I've kind of seen that all of the flour has been incorporated, but there's still little bits on the side, I'm going to kick it up into second gear and then go from there. Sometimes I'll even do it before, but it's getting incorporated really good. I'll go ahead and go so we can get this moving. So just get a mixing bowl and either use your hands. There's such thing as a dough whisk. People have used that. I don't know if you can use a regular whisk, but just get in there with your hands and mix it all together and just kind of like mix and like pull and mix and pull. Like you become the mixer, okay? I don't know if you have like a food processor that might have like a dough blade on it. I've never used that, but I don't see why it couldn't work. Most people hand mix, to be honest with you. I just was starting to do so much dough that I was like, I don't have like, it was hurting my hands, my arms, and I was like, screw it, I'm just going to use the stand mixer. And honestly, it's been fantastic, and my bread really turns out well. So here's where we're going to start using this bread scraper. I scrape off as much as I can on the hook. Okay, and now that is gonna, this I would put into my my sink, and I would spray this off, okay? Or when I'm done, because I know we've talked about not putting stuff in down the drain, when I'm done, I will often spray this out, fill it with water. All the tools that I've used, I have very limited amount of starter and dough on them. I just soapy water and I soak everything in there for many hours, and then it all comes off very clean and very diluted, okay? So here is what our dough looks like. This is like a shaggy dough. It's not super wet, so notice how nothing stuck to my finger. So I always try and get as much off of the sides as I can. Even if it's a little bit of flour, or you see in your dough like a chunk of flour that didn't really like mix in well, don't worry about it, because over the next like hour and a half, you're going to be using your hands to stretch and fold this, and everything eventually gets incorporated, okay? So that's there. Not quite done with that guy, but we are done with these things. I'll put that there. Okay, so this is what it looks like. I am now going to lightly cover it, and we're just leaving it to rise. So I'm gonna leave it here. Right now, I just want everyone to notice how shaggy looking it is, how, you know, there's all these like little mountains. There's not a lot of bubbles or anything in it. You'll see that after the first time we start stretching and folding it, that it's actually going to start coming together. So this is when I take my watch and I set, usually I do 15 minutes, but for the sake of the fact that we have less time, I'm going to go with a 10-minute timer so that I can show you guys exactly what happens. So I do that on my watch, but you could use your old-fashioned timer, or hey Alexa, set a timer for 10 minutes, anything like that. But you're going to find that really you want, and I'll go to the next slide, when it comes to proofing, this stretch and fold, we're going to, I suggest 4 to 5 every 15 to 30 minutes. You don't have to. Okay, so now we've put our dough out. We've put them in, we've done it in 2. So you kind of just move one aside or to the corner. And so this is where you just kind of take your dough and very arbitrarily just roll it into like a kind of a ball. Doesn't have to be a perfect ball. You just want it to be a little bit more uniformed. And then once it's uniformed, this is where I like to flatten the dough a bit. So now I push my hands into the dough, and you'll often find that bubbles like are forming in your dough. Go ahead and pop those bubbles, okay? You don't need those. And then I'm making it into like a really, I say square, but I mean, it is not like a cute square at all. Okay, so if you're going to add any sort of flavors, or a lot of people call them inclusions, into your bread, when you have your flattened square, okay? And often when I'm adding inclusions, I actually kind of try to make my square a little bit bigger so you have more surface space. Otherwise, when it's a plain one, it can be a very tiny square that's kind of like, you know, most of your dough. Flatten that out, and then now I'm adding apples into there. I'm folding the feet into the middle, into the belly button, and then I often add the apples there too on that flattened surface. Then I'll pull one arm over. Sometimes I'll add a few things here, but if you put too much stuff in your bread, A, it might be hard to close, or B, you might be tearing the dough as you're shaping it. So at least do it in those 2 spaces. The first flattened area, fold the feet over and do the apples there, and then do the rest as we've talked about. Pull it over onto itself, but be more gentle with your shaping and just pull it into itself. The sides will be open. I pinch the sides. I don't try and like go all over when I have inclusions inside, because now jalapenos are popping out, apples are popping out. Like, is that bad? It's not bad if like one, like you make a hole and there's a little bit there. It's fine. When you bake it, you're going to get, you know, a little jalapeno popping out on the side. But if you keep going and all of a sudden it's just going to ruin the integrity of the dough, and your dough is not going to really work out, okay? So just be very gentle when you've put something in the dough. Yes. Okay. Let's do this stretch and fold again. So the interesting thing here is I can see like flour here that hasn't been totally incorporated, but that's okay. Remember, like if we see chunks of flour, it's going to eventually incorporate. So out from the outside, now see how it's not ripping as much? Okay. So watch as I pull this one. You're really starting to see some of those striations in there. And that's like the gluten forming. Okay, so we're pulling that over onto itself. And this time I'll go ahead and pass this one around so everyone can kind of like look at it and see. So I'm also just going to kind of pull it a little bit into a ball so it's a little bit more form. But already, see how much smoother it is? And this is only our second time stretching and folding it. Okay, now we're going to talk scoring. So I did bring a little dough left over that I made the other day. And this is not a true to size dough for what we're working with here. It's just the way that I measure for my orders. I always end up with a little bit of extra dough. So this is what I've pulled out of my fridge the next day, okay?
Is that approximately your half?
So this is smaller than my half. I would say the halves, gosh, you know, it's been so long since I have made a half. But I measure my dough out to be 700 grams. So I would say 700 to 750 gram is usually what you're gonna get. This is the other one of my proofing bowls that I use in order to have like an oval shape. It also is good for my smaller breads that I use, okay? So obviously I pulled it out of the fridge and I took the shower cap off, and now I'm going to unfold it here from that. And now see, we see no mohawk at all. If I look close enough, I can definitely see like where it's sealed, but I mean, that really is not that easy to tell, okay? It is, it's a little wet, but just where the dough has been sitting, and that's okay. So now we're going to score because we're getting ready to go into the oven, okay? So this is where I get my parchment paper, and this is our bottom. I flip it over onto my hand. This is what it looks like. This one looks a little flat, not a big deal. Usually when they're in my round ones, they don't look as flat because the bowl is round, right? This bottom is flat. But yeah, go ahead.
Before you continue, did you wet the tea towel before you put it in?
No, dry tea towel and then over on itself. But you do want to retain the moisture within this, or you'll have a very dry top or bottom, and then it doesn't hurt the bread, to be honest with you. It just doesn't like look as pretty when it bakes, okay? Yeah, a dry tea towel. This is the first time we're gonna use our mister. So I spray, and it just has a nice little mister of water on it. And now we're gonna sprinkle some rice flour. You can totally use regular flour. It's fine. I use rice flour. I just kind of do like a generous sprinkling on there. And then we just kind of rub that in. Okay, so we've rubbed it in. And that's so far what we're looking like, okay? And now you're gonna score it. To score it means to just give it a nice slice. And the reason we do that is because this thing is full of air, full of like carbon, CO2, right? So when we give it a score, we allow that in the baking process, a lot of that to release. If we don't score it, you're gonna find it's gonna score itself in the process. It's gonna bust open here and there. And even sometimes mine will still bust open, but very easy. You just take the sharp side of your razor and you go from one end to the other, okay? So now we have this. So a lot of people are like, what's the depth that I should do? It's a very small, I mean, that's just a couple centimeters in there, okay? Often in times though, what I will do is I'll do a second score, and instead of going straight through, I turn it onto its side and I go right under one of these lines and like kind of to make a lip, okay? So you score again. You don't have to do this, okay? I score just a little bit more on there, okay? So I can go ahead and just kind of show you guys. So see how that second slit kind of gave a little bit more underneath. And then this likely is going to be the one that comes and pops up when you're making your bread. So see how deep that score is? It's not very deep at all. And then usually you really want to get this into the oven pretty quickly because it's now losing air, right? It's starting to deflate. So that's the real quick before we go ahead and put this in the oven, my timer's going off for our last one here. So let's do that. So now our dough is like really getting super smooth. It's almost at a similar consistency to this guy right here. So I'm going to show you the stretch or the coil fold. So what I'm going to do, and this is a little hard from my angle to show you, but I pull it in the middle and I pull it up, and then you flip it so that that end that you pulled up kind of goes onto the bottom. I turn it around, I pull it up, and I flip it over onto itself, and then I'll go to the two other sides that I haven't done that on, and I'll flip 2 more times. And really you're just kind of pulling it up and folding it underneath. So before we pull it up and put it onto the top, onto itself, let me pull it out so you guys can kind of, so I'm gonna really put it in there like that. So it's folded on under itself. But look how smooth it is now. It's really smoothed out. And that's why I like the coil folds, because you really see a difference in terms of the way your dough looks. It stopped being so shaggy and now it's really smoothed out. And this is the point where we're gonna wait a couple of hours to let it double, or you can do another fold in 15, 30 minutes. Yes. Guys, life happens, kids happen, things happen. You go out and you forgot that you were making dough. Okay, it happens. It's going to happen to you guys. Okay, I promise. And this is going to overrise. You're going to come home and this thing is going to be like outside of your shower cap. I promise. But this is your opportunity to make focaccia dough. Okay, that is when you take the dough, cut it in half. I would get like a little, pan. Just put a bunch of oil in there and then just like plop it into that. Pull it a little bit on the sides and just let it sit out. Sit out, and you'll watch it. It'll still grow in there. Let it sit and sit and sit. It doesn't need to go in a refrigerator overnight. You just let it sit until you're like, oh my gosh, that thing has grown even more. Then you get your oven on, you drizzle olive oil, do the fingers in there. You'll see really cool bubbles, and you bake it that way. So if you ever feel like you've like screwed up the dough, just go straight into focaccia and you'll be just as happy, because focaccia is super tasty as well. Okay. I often add like rosemary, garlic, tomatoes, salt on mine. Like you can add anything that you want. So don't feel like you have failed if you've overproofed it. You actually then now just get to make focaccia at the end of the day rather than waiting until tomorrow. Okay. Scored. So notice though, since I've been hanging out here for a little bit, it's like opening a little bit, right? This isn't horrible, but I do find that like score it right when you're ready to go into the oven. Okay. Do not wait. So you have, before you've pulled this out of the fridge, you've now put this in your oven at 500 degrees to preheat your oven, which is on this slide, okay? You're preheating your oven with this in it at 500. The reason you're doing that is because you want this very hot, and you'll already find that like inside it's creating a very warm environment for your bread to go into, okay? Now we have preheated it, and we hear that the oven is beeped, it's ready, so we pull it out, we take the lid off. Using the parchment paper, I hold it and I drop it in there, okay? Sometimes because it gets a little, the paper gets a little folded over onto itself, I will just kind of very carefully, because it's gonna be hot, spread it out a little bit. If your loaf is really big and this paper is bent over on itself, it'll like go into the dough, and then you'll find like a little dent in the side of the dough or the bread when it's done, which honestly, you guys, is not a big deal at all. It's just more of like my aesthetic that I care about. Then I take my water spritzer and I spritz the top of it again, because this is creating our steam-like environment in there as it bakes. The more water, the better. We don't like that philosophy when we're making the dough because it's too hard to work with, but when we're baking, all of the moisture that's within the dough, as well as adding this, really keeps steam moving in there, okay? Now we are going to put the oven down to 450. So we were at 500, move it to 450, and then put this in the oven. Now I set a timer for 30 minutes, okay? And I do 30 minutes at 450. Obviously, everybody's oven can be a little different. So if you find that after 30 minutes in the oven, when we take it out to put it up on the lifting apparatus, that it's really a dark bottom, then go down to 25 minutes and then take it out. Ultimately, the whole baking process for me is about 43 to 45 minutes total. So that's just a good rule of thumb in terms of how long you want your bread to bake, but do what your oven does. Or maybe your Dutch oven is super old, or maybe it's brand new. Maybe that heating element is a little different, okay? So now, obviously, I'm using my big gloves that cover my whole body, essentially, and putting this into the oven at the 450, setting my timer for 30 minutes, okay? Okay, so our timer has gone off. It's been 30 minutes. I've now pulled this out of the oven, boom, steam is coming out of this. So do not pull it out like this, okay, guys? That's not the facial that we are looking for. That is too hot, okay? You will have like super red skin. So you pull that out. I often take my gloves off because I find that the paper, if I don't have good dexterity, it's ripping and then this is falling. Usually you'll have these little tabs. You just pull it out, put the lifting apparatus in, put it back on. This is when I will spray it again, okay? I feel like I'm actually the only person I've ever known who's done it this way, but now I'm just adding more moisture. Your bread is not gonna look like dough. It's going to look baked, okay? You're gonna see a cute little ear. If you don't get an ear and it's flattened where you scored it, don't worry, okay? A lot of people at the beginning of their journeys of sourdough, the score is very flat, okay? Just don't worry about it. I promise over time it's gonna happen. And adding more moisture is always gonna be a good bet for you. Obviously, put this back on. I find the older ones are a little bit more like hard to match up. It's the same with my other one at home. And now we're putting it back in the oven. The oven is still at 450, and I'm setting my timer for 13 minutes. And the reason for that is that I often find that 13 minutes is the number. But if you take it out at 13 minutes and lift the top and you're like, oh, it's still so white, it doesn't look as baked as I'd like it, go ahead and just put it back in for like 2 minutes at a time. Maybe your oven wants to cook it at 15 minutes, okay? So you can do, just play around the first couple of times. Like I said, 45 minutes is really the sweet spot for my oven. And the moisture helps. And our Dutch oven is what the closest we can get to a real baker's oven, because baker's ovens pour steam into the heat of the oven to like circulate over the bread. So that's essentially what we're doing, just on a smaller scale, okay?
So it bakes with the lid on all the time.
I bake it with the lid on all the time. All other recipes, again, I'm the only person who I know sprays it and bakes the lid the whole time. I used to not, and it would just get so dark on top. And sometimes I would take it out and I would do the internal temperature. So at the end, I'm checking it and it wouldn't be done. And I'm like, well, it's already so burnt. So a lot of times I'd be just putting the lid back on to finish it off. And then I found like there's really not that big of a difference between having the lid on and the lid off. So I do the lid the whole time. Most people do not. So don't feel like it's a rule you have to follow. It's kind of the same concept of the reason we cold proof is to get this to rise, but at a slower rate. Same thing with the temperature in the kitchen. It's always going to rise. The starter is always going to rise. It's just going to rise faster when it's at 78 degrees or more. Anything less than that, it's just taking a little bit longer to get it done, but it's still going to work for you. Okay. So these are a good rule of thumb, and these are good for you guys. This is what we want to see with our starter. After it's fed and it's active, it's doubled, that's all the way to the right. Once it's deflated, which is basically kind of what I had worked with today, that's when you do want to feed it, but I also have made dough and sourdough with that. It still works. The one all the way to the left, that's the hungry starter. That's the hooch that's on top. If you have that, you definitely need to feed your starter. You can pour that off or you can stir that in. That does not mean your starter is dead. It just means your starter has not been fed, and now the byproduct has created an environment for a liquid to form, okay? So that's a good visual for that. This is just a reminder for the dehydrated starter. I think everyone except for just a couple of you are new from last year, and we'll give you, with the dehydrated starter packet, we have a instruction sheet that goes with it, okay? And that's what a lot of people have been referencing today. I was doing day 3 on my starter, or day 4, and things like that. So, but like I said, starter is very, very, very forgiving. One thing I do want to talk about before we do this dough is the cutting of the bread. A lot of people do kind of struggle with that, and that's kind of weird to say, but sometimes it's hard to know how to cut the bread. So the way that I do it, and obviously I don't have a loaf here right now to show you, but let's say I have a nice round loaf. Okay, we've waited 2 hours to cut into it. The reason we wait 2 hours is because it's still cooking inside, just like meat would cook after you pull it off of the grill. You're still letting it finish on the inside. So we've waited 2 hours. Now we have our bread knife. We're on our cutting board. What I do is I take that loaf and I cut it right in half, right down the middle. So now we have 2 loaves, 2 parts of the loaf, and one side is flat. I now take that flat side and I put it down. So it's like a half moon. And now I take my knife and I cut like that. It's much easier for you to, the bread is so floppy because the inside is so nice and soft that it's easier for you to hold the side of the bread without it going all over and then maybe cutting yourself or getting hurt. So I do that. The only thing is you end up with obviously half slices. So if you're looking to make a loaf of bread, or like a sandwich, like a whole sandwich, then you can either cut it in half again and then go from the inside out, and you'll get 2 big slices, full slices, or keep it full and go from the outside in, give the little butt part to the dog or something, or eat it, whatever you want. And then now you'll also have slices. But honestly, the easiest way to do it is to cut it in half, put it the flat side down, and go like that. I also suggest that if you're going to freeze a loaf, that you cut the whole thing first and then put it into the freezer. That way you can just pull out the slices that you want, let them thaw, and then eat them. You can definitely freeze the whole loaf. And I talked about this last class, but if you're going to pull that loaf out of the freezer and you want it to be exactly like it was when you first baked it, you put it under your faucet, you run water over it. You don't be afraid because it's frozen, so it's not like soaking it up like water. It's frozen. You put water all over it and you stick it in your oven for like 350 for maybe 10, 12 minutes, and it crisps up perfectly. When it's frozen like that, though, you definitely just keep an eye on it because the inside is frozen as well. You may need to do it for a little bit longer. But if you've had it on your counter for 4 days and it's been in a baggie and it's soft and it's not as crunchy, you can do the exact same thing. Run it under water real quick and put it back in your oven, and it's going to get that beautiful crispy top and super soft inside. Okay? You should never have to start making a new starter over and over and over again. You always want to keep, let's say there's starter in your jar right now. You've pulled that out of the fridge, you fed it, it grew. Now, it's not enough for your dough, so you're going to discard a little bit, feed it again. Now it's very active. Now you might want to put it into a bigger container, feed it in that container so it has more room to grow. Once that's grown, you're going to go use that in your dough. But you still have some left over in your little guy here, and he'll go back in the fridge until the next time you want to bake again. And that's why I refer to him as your forever starter, because he's always there with you. And you're using him to stimulate and make more starter so that you can make your dough.
But he's not getting fed.
He's always getting fed. You're always feeding starter. If you don't feed starter,
So
it can't grow. At least once a week, you want to feed him. So if you're baking once a week, that's fine because you're going to pull him out, you're going to feed him. If you're not baking once a week, just pull them out, throw some flour and water in them, stir it up. We know what kind of consistency we're looking for. Let it grow a little bit, let it get active, and then put it back in your refrigerator. You never want to not feed starter. Starter needs to be fed in order to be active, in order to be used in sourdough, because you need to have a rising agent in your dough. Just like we use instant yeast in other baking recipes, we need starter to act as our yeast. If it's not been fed and it's not active, you're going to be like, well, why isn't my dough rising? I did stretch and folds and nothing's rising. Well, it wouldn't rise because there's nothing active within the starter to make it rise. So always be feeding your starter. If you leave your starter on the counter, you need to feed it a minimum of once a day, okay? Or it will go bad quickly. But the goal is that you have a jar that has even a small amount of starter in it in your refrigerator always to pull from so that you can make more starter to use in a recipe. You never want to not have starter in the fridge because then you can't make sourdough, okay? You would have to then go back to your dehydrated, what you have left over, and start over. You'd have to call your friend and be like, do you have any active starter? Or you'd reach out to me and I would get you some more, okay? So we always want to feed our starter. And then if you're on Facebook as well, there always is like sourdough for beginner groups or sourdough something or another group. You can always join those. And a lot of people are really good in terms of you put pictures up and be like, what happened? What did I do wrong? Just be prepared to get a lot of information from a lot of people who are going to be like, you did this wrong. That's not right. Your bread doesn't look done. You overproofed it. I mean, again, 6,000 years ago, we were making bread and no one had opinions about it because we were all eating it within a community, right? So just be mindful that on Facebook, you're going to have a huge community of people who can be very technical, okay? And we all know often on social media when people comment, they're not always very nice. So just go into that with a grain of salt, okay? Okay, she had a great idea the other day where she was like, you should show some of your pictures of your bread. And that is a good idea. So this is one of 2 slides. So I told you guys I started this whole journey because I wanted to paint bread. So I have a couple of my painted loaves here. That one over there is more of like my fall one. You can see like a little pumpkin. Somebody asked here for poppies. Was it poppies? I think poppies for her luncheon. So I did that for her. This is what I did last year, and I'll be doing this again. This is my pumpkin-shaped loaf. This is just a classic loaf. This one was more like a pumpkin one where I like included pumpkin puree into it, which was actually challenging to work with because it was very slimy. This one is my blueberry lemon loaf. You can see little pieces of lemon in there. That's a really popular one. This is my jalapeno cheddar and bacon. This is, yes, she loves the jalapeno cheddar. I recently added bacon to it, and I was like, well, this is like one of my favorite, but both jalapeno cheddar and the bacon, either one is good. This is the newest one I made yesterday. I was experimenting for my Thanksgiving menu. This is sweet potato and sage in there. So I have roasted sweet potato and like crispy sage from the garden. This one I call my Windy City loaf. It's where I take spicy giardiniera and I mix that in there, and that one's super good. Like if you're making Italian beefs one night or for the sandwich, it's really good because it's got a little kick to it. Here's my focaccia. This is the raw version of it because it's much cuter here than it is after it's baked because you see like the cutie little bubbles everywhere. This is my cinnamon sugar. This is what, like, you know, back in the day when I was a kid, we would always, for breakfast, a lot of times, toast and then butter and cinnamon sugar. So that's kind of like my play on that. This is a s'mores loaf. So this has, you can kind of see there's graham crackers here, but I do put graham crackers in the dough as well. They kind of bake out, but it still gives that flavor. And then chocolate, and that's fluff that's in there, but I also have marshmallows inside. And then I think I did all of them. Let's go to the next one. So the paint is, I got it online. It's edible food gel. So it just comes in these tiny little containers, and it's food coloring, but that's made into a gel base. And then I would just get a white one that was very big, and I have like a little palette, like a little ceramic dish with a couple different spots, and I would do a little bit of white in each one, and then I'd add a color, mix it up. So I could do blue, but I could add more blue color if I wanted a lot more blue, or I could add less blue if I wanted a lighter blue. And then just regular paint brushes, like just regular art brush paints, I would do that. So it was really fun. You can just, on Amazon or Google, edible food gel, and that's what I used.
Oh my God, look at that.
No. So that's when before you score it. You're painting on your dough before you score it. But make sure when you're painting that you know you're going to have to score the bread, right? You can go ahead and score the bread all the way on the side as well, because if you're painting it, you don't really care to have that cute little lip. But just know that wherever you're painting, you are going to slice down the loaf. So, you know, look for the flower that was like not as cute as the rest, okay? Okay, yeah, this is one I'm super proud of. Somebody asked me to make a snake for their daughter, and they had it in like a Harry Potter cookbook. And he gave it to me, and that is what I made on the first attempt to practice. The second attempt, not so much. So I was like, I did it for you, but you know, the first one looked really cool. So that was kind of a wild, fun experiment, and then obviously painted on him as well. And then his tongue is like a little peeled cucumber with like just cut out that way stuff. Here's another painted loaf. This is Christmas. This is my newest one, the apple cider one with apples that we use cider in the dough, not the starter. Okay. This is my everything seasoning. This one's really cool. So I don't put everything seasoning in the loaf, but right before I score the loaf, I spritz water on it, and then I roll the top into the seeds, into the seasoning, and then they stick, and then score it, and you have that. Same thing I do here for my pink salt, just pink Himalayan salt. I just thought that was kind of fun because pink kitchen, pink salt, you know, trying to be cute. This is obviously my classic. This is where I have the little scores, and then this is, you know, that's my caramelized onion. Yeah, that's caramelized onion. I think it's also brie because I do feel like I see a little melty cheese within that. So that's my caramelized onion and brie. Those all go inside, and that one is really good. Not doing that, and then this. So those are most of my breads. I definitely have more, but these are really the main ones. And then here, you know, you can use this QR code, and then you'll definitely find my whole menu that I have. So there might be pictures on there that I didn't do. But if you open up your camera, you take a picture, or you open up your camera, you can pull this up. This will take you to my Bakesy site. And that's the site where I have all of the breads that I have available and all the items I have available. You'll find the focaccias there. Sometimes you'll find cinnamon rolls there. Most of the time you won't. I really only make cinnamon rolls for one customer. They're not horrible. They're just kind of an extra thing that I don't prefer to do because I'm a sourdough girl, right? Like I'm an expert at sourdough, and that's where I like to keep myself. But yeah, you guys are, anytime you're welcome to order bread from me. I said I bake weekly. This is where you can order it. But you can also email me, text me, and say, hey, I want to, you know, maybe order bread, or I have a question, whatever. All of that's here. And then I am on Facebook and Instagram. So if you're on either of those platforms, feel free to follow me. I'm not super active on social media, I'll admit. I love using it as a platform to get business from, but I have such a cool grassroots following of people who order from me and tell their friends or hear about me from somewhere else. And I truly think that's the coolest way to make a business and really find good people. So I know we don't have much time left, but I wanted to see if I could show you guys the shaping, because this feels like it's in a pretty good spot for that. So let me kind of clear off this mess. Usually my kitchen doesn't look like this because I'm like very efficient, but I'll tell you at the beginning, I was like, where is everything? It's all over. And you know, that's how you guys will probably be for a minute, but don't worry about it. I am going to take my watch off for this because it'll get all gunky. Okay, so we have our proofing basket. All right, remember? Yes, and if you're doing your own like I do, it's just like a tea towel or a kitchen towel that goes like this. Know that if your kitchen towel does have like a pattern or texture to it, you will get that on the top of your dough. I don't often find that it like once the dough is baked that you see that, but I have seen people do cool things where they take like netting and place it on there and like really create a cool texture when they're trying to make really fun, fancy dough, loaves. So yeah, so it's just a cloth. A lot of people will tell you to put flour in here. I've never had to do that, and I've never had dough stick before, okay? So I'm gonna put that there. We'll put this aside because we'll be using that again. Okay, we're gonna plop her down. So I often find that I do kind of have to pull her aside. Sometimes I like to just sit here for a few minutes and let her like get off by herself. You don't have to do that. I often use the scraper to get everything else because mine are coming out of big tubs. So, but you're not really ruining anything by helping. Okay. Sometimes it's ready to go and it's just going to plop right out for you. But obviously she is not fully proofed. Whoop, there she goes. Sometimes you'll have like a piece that's ripped off. Just pull that out and stick it back in there. Okay. Oil this? I've never needed to, no. But I always have used plastic for my proofing situation, okay? I have used glass, but I usually am using the glass with the cinnamon rolls, and in that case I am oiling it because it said to, but this shouldn't be sticking. If it is, you got to reduce your water in your. So I use gloves at this time, and this is only because I don't like the dough getting into my cuticles and then like living there for a while. And I also find that like it's a smoother surface, so I'm not getting dough to stick to me. But I'm also busting out like 10 or 12 loaves at a time, so that is better for me. So I often sprinkle just a little bit on top, especially if there is an area, and then I'll kind of pull her up, put her there. Now I'm going to cut it in half. Okay. If you want to, use your kitchen scale to weigh the loaves. I feel like this one's going to be maybe a little bit bigger than that one, but if you don't really care about what the size is, just, go by your. So see, the first thing I said after that is we just kind of make it into like a little ball. And I'm already getting a little sticky. And truthfully, you guys, that's because this is not ready. It's sticky, but it's ready enough for me to show you. So I put it back down. Hi. Okay. I'll just wash my hands with a little flour here. She's going to need more flour than usual, so don't over flour. Only flour a little bit if you're getting stuck. So now she's kind of in that like little ball that I talked about first. Now we're going to flatten her. So this is where I just kind of like push in. Just kind of in a circle, but then I'm like pulling it out and stretching from the top. I typically find that you have more dough concentrated right here, but none of that really matters, okay? Right now is when I'm going to put in my apples, my jalapenos, anything that you want to include, okay? Then we take the feet. This is sliding a little bit. Let me see. That might help. Okay, so now we take the feet, pull it and stretch it, and fold it right into the middle, okay? Right there into like belly button area. Now we've got two arms. Pull, put one, right in together. Okay, so now see how we're like creating this. So now we take the pigtails and we pull, and I always try to kind of pull it as close as possible to this area because we need to seal this up, right? We need to get this sealed. So now it's sealed, so now I roll it over onto itself. So this is the top of my bread, and now I'm going to pull it, and I'm going to get it here so I don't. So now I'm pulling it into itself, okay? Pulling it in, and as you can see, this kind of puffs up, but it also tightens on top. So that was 2, 3, and at 3, we're already here. So see how it's closing? I would say I would want to do just a few more. So I'm pulling it into itself from different angles. Okay. I feel pretty good about that. So now I'm going to take this, pull it over, sealed, but not 100%, right? Like see how it's closed? So this is where I'm giving it my mohawk. Any area that I feel like right along this line, I'm just pinching it and zippering it up, okay? And now we are going in here, and we're putting our cap on. Refrigerator, okay? And then tomorrow, when you take this out, remember that the part that's facing you is the bottom of your bread. So you're flipping your bread onto the parchment paper because that smooth part on the top is what we really wanted. We really want for the top of our dough, okay? This one's a little tinier, but that's okay. I usually only make the tiny ones for my house anymore because Lord knows I do not need that much bread around. Like, yeah, sourdough is better for your gut, but it's still carbs, okay? Still carbs. Okay, so this one's a little bit more rectangular, not a big deal. See the thickness of the side there? What are we saying? Maybe it's a 1/2 inch. If you go too thin, you're at more risk for when you're shaping it at ripping it, okay? So that's why I always suggest keeping it a little thick. But now I'm putting my apples in, pulling, putting more apples here. If I'm going to be adding more inclusions, then I actually pull this side over and a little more apples, then pour that side over. And I do kind of manipulate the stretch there sometimes, okay? So I'm doing the same maneuver. I'm just doing it a little different to shut all of those things inside. And then we pull this one over. Sometimes I'll kind of do that. So we're assuming there's jalapenos or apples or something in here. Now I'm just going to pull this way, and then I push this side back in. And now I want to be done because I have so much stuff in there. I'm going to rip the top of this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch the sides to kind of close the side. Okay. This one's a little bit more stuck. Still pretty sealed, right? Pretty sealed. Now when I do my mohawk, sometimes you got to shove those guys back in. I go all the way from the side to the side, okay? And this is good because we're just sealing the deal here. Let's see, let's do this one, huh? Okay. And now I put her to bed, wrap her in tight, and then put the lid on. And it goes in the fridge overnight with this guy, okay? And then the next morning, they're cold, they're ready to go. You pull them out, drop them onto your parchment paper, spritz with water, dust with your duster, give it a slit. But when do we pull it out of the fridge? Before the oven's preheated or after? Exactly, after. Because if we pull this out, like most ovens to get to 500, they take a minute to get there. You know, you're getting 20, 30 minutes sometimes. If this is sitting out here for 30 minutes, it's just going to slowly start kind of giving up on you. Then you're going to get flatter bread, okay? The goal is to take this out right at the end, and that really should be working for you. Keep trying. This does not always come right at the beginning, the shaping. I remember at the beginning, I was using this a lot to like pull and shape. I wasn't even doing that, you know, the hands, the arms, and the pigtails. I wasn't even doing that at first. I was doing like a weird braid kind of situation, which you'll find sometimes I do that one when I'm making sourdough bread bowls, which I do. Actually didn't have a picture of those up. I have this, these people that I know in South Elgin who make soup out of their home, and they sell to a lot of people in their community. So we'll often partner, and I'll make little sourdough bread bowls, and they'll buy soup and their bread bowl at the same time. Or sometimes I'll just even sell, especially in the colder winter, 2 sourdough bread bowls at a time in a package. And honestly, it's just this, but in a much smaller amount. And then I want to say it's like 250 in terms of the grams for the dough when I weigh it out. 250, you do the same thing. You make it a dough, put it in a proofing basket. At that point, I am using more of a measuring cup that I got from the dollar store. They're fairly large, but they're maybe like a 4-cup style measuring cup, because they'll take that smaller dough and keep it contained small. And then I'll just slit the top of that, like when I score it, I'll score it in a 4, like a square, 4 slits, and then bake it up. Less time on that. Like if you're gonna have smaller amount of dough, you're gonna need less time, okay? So if you're only doing, if you're gonna take one, like you're gonna cut the recipe in half, but then cut these guys in half and make sourdough bread bowls or just smaller, do not cook for 45 minutes, okay? You're gonna burn it. So just, you know, always rule of thumb, I always say go for 20 minutes, pull it out, see where it's at, put it on the lifting apparatus, and then put it back in. Usually you can tell by halfway through how much time you really need to have left, okay? And that's it. You guys are just gonna kill it. I know it. I feel it. Every time I'm done with the cloths, I've got a little basket. I throw all of the towels in, and then I wash all of those. I don't wash these every time. I take these off. I mean, I can't wash these. So I take them off. See, this is already pretty wet. I'll just stick it in like that, and then I just leave these out, just like a plastic baggie. You know, all of us wash in our gallon baggies and leave them out to dry and just let it dry. And once it's dry, I put those all back in their own gallon baggie to like hang out. No, I did buy these off Amazon. I did go to the dollar store and I found some shower caps, but honestly, they weren't great and I didn't love them. So I have not found these at the dollar store. I found these on Amazon and they come in 3 sizes, which is great because this big size works really well for these. There's a yellow one that's a medium size, so I can use yellow or green on here. And then there's an even smaller pink size that is good too because those work good for the sourdough bread bowl covers or for your starter jar. It's a good cover for the starter jar, okay? Yeah, I'm taking the parchment paper, using it to lift the bread out of the Dutch oven, just put it aside, put the lifting apparatus in there, use the parchment paper to lift your dough back in, give it a spritz, back on, and in the oven. So yeah, really the parchment paper is there for handling of the dough, not necessarily any other reason. Because if you just use parchment paper, no lifting apparatus, you're gonna get a burnt bottom on your loaf, okay? So, yes.
Lindsay, you're a wonderful teacher.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys. I love your enthusiasm, and thank you so much for your interest in wanting to learn about sourdough. I'm so happy to teach people. So